A new perspective also on the topic of smart cities. So we will have Vera, my colleague from King's College London, with us, and Vera will introduce herself because she has a mixed background. She's not only an academic researcher, but also she's working for an architectural firm, plus she has a lot of experience as a local councillor. So she has been in the city council of Moscow, and so she has various different perspectives from the way she approaches the topic of smart cities or urbanism. She will also talk about the sharing economy that we heard about on Tuesday a little bit more. So she brings in the broad perspectives that we already had. And without further ado, I will hand over to Vera. I will afterwards moderate the discussion that we will have as usual. And Vera was already concerned that, of course, there will be a lot of noise in the room, but I'm sure that we will listen all very attentively to our presenter. So without further ado, Vera, the stage is yours, and I'm very pleased to have you here. So, yeah, Vera.
Thank you, Sven. Good evening, everyone. It's really a great privilege for me to be speaking there, and these are not cheap words because I was here as a student at one of the academy seminars years ago, 5 years ago exactly. There was a seminar about local politics and citizen participation, and it was one of the best experience of that kind, probably the best in my life, and so Sven mentioned that I have a mixed background, and that particular seminar, Naumann seminar, it kind of made me choose not a different career path, but after that I decided that I want to do a degree and dig deeper into urban development, to switch from pure practice to more like theory. So I think you're very happy being here, and I'm jealous that you're here for the whole week, for the whole course, and I'm only here for tonight. And yeah, the topic is polycentric urbanism from sharing economy to private cities. So in your schedule, I think it was titled Free Market Urbanism. So polycentric, market, voluntary urbanism, I use them all as synonyms. And basically, these are all the antonyms for central planning and urban development. So, can you raise your hands, those of you who live in a city? Yeah, everyone I see. I guess everyone lives in the city. And half of the world is going to live in the city within a few decades, according to the United Nations. And it means that the rules that are governing our cities are affecting our day-to-day lives, and the decisions that urban planners are making, they are in a way directing our own decisions. And still, when I was elected, I realized that, okay, like the classical liberal theory has answers to many questions, but there's no clear question on what to do with cities. I mean that it's been 30 years since the Berlin Wall fell, and this is more or less there is more or less a consensus that central planning is not the most efficient and not the most fair way of dealing with policy issues. And this is true in most spheres, like in developed liberal countries, we mostly rely on voluntary cooperation of people and a free market to solve most issues, but still urban development is an outlier because most people, even those who share the ideas, like liberal ideas in other spheres, they believe that the cities should be planned centrally and that it is up to the government to direct urban development. So I know that you've been discussing Edward Glaser's book here, Triumph of the City. So he gave what I think is one of the best definitions of a city, is that the city conceptually is the absence of space between people and firms. And this absence means that like what economists would call minimizing what economists would call transaction costs. So when people are living in a dense city, there's minimum distance within consumers and producers, within people who want to meet each other. So it facilitates the exchange of knowledge, exchange of skills, exchange of goods and services, and it creates all the diversity that we enjoy while living in cities. And as I said, unfortunately, this process is being hindered by a lot of regulations of the cities that we live in. And this is how this story started roughly a century ago. So first I'll ask you a question. Look at these two pictures. Which city would you want to live in? Who wants to live in this city? Okay. Who wants to live in this city? Well, this city wins. And the story, as I said, started in the beginning of the 20th century when, as you know, the world was obsessed with utopias. Many of them later turned out to be dystopias, but this is a different story. And the architects were following the same trend. So more and more architects in the beginning of the 20th century started thinking that the domain of architecture is not just in the aim of architecture, the ultimate goal is not just creating beautiful buildings, but it's rebuilding the society on a fairer ground, and through urban design and through architecture, creating a new utopian society. And there was a whole new. Thank you. Yes. Thanks. It's better? Yes. Yeah, and the leader of this new movement, and one of the most famous people who guided it was Swiss-French architect Le Corbusier. I'm sure many of you heard that name. And one of his most famous, or should I say infamous proposals, was to basically demolish a large part of the central Paris and build it anew with wide avenues, uniformly looking skyscrapers, where people will be living while relying on automobiles and having fairly equal access to all the city facilities like parks, recreations, water and schools and hospitals and so on. And as we know, fortunately, Paris was not demolished, and we can still enjoy it the way it used to be, enjoy the ancient parts of it. But these ideas, the Corbusier's ideas, were picked up in many other countries. First of all, the socialist countries, but not only. And I grew up in Moscow in a place that looked pretty much like the picture on the left. But of course, not everyone agreed that urban development should be made in a top-down, centralized way, and that there are some people, architects or urbanists, who are smarter than others and who can tell the others how to live their life, where to live, how to navigate the city. And they were people who challenged these ideas, and the most vocal of them and the most influential of them was Jane Jacobs, an American journalist and the author of a very prominent book called Death and Life of Great American Cities. Interestingly, she wasn't an architect or an urbanist. She was a journalist, and she was writing about architecture, and at some point she realized, while traveling across America, she noticed something that worried her. She noticed that American cities, it was back in the 50s, were getting more and more uniform, more like each other, less lively, because of these master plans that were imposed down on them by master planners who were not walking along the streets and didn't know how the cities lived, how people lived, and they had their own ideas in their heads how the city should function. And she started traveling all over the US, and she was writing down all this, everything she was noticing. And of course, they were not just bad examples. This is why the book is called Death and Life of Great American Cities. They were very good examples as well. And this picture on the right is one of her favorite ones. It was taken in Boston, the North End district. She arrived there and she saw a neighborhood that, she saw a very lively neighborhood where children were playing in the streets, where people were saying hello to each other because they knew each other, where people were stopping by the shops to say hi to the shop owners, where there were very little cars and there was music playing, and in general it was a very nice atmosphere. And the day after she saw it, she had a meeting in the local city administration, and she mentioned this to the vice mayor, to the deputy mayor, saying that, you know, I've seen this place, North End, this is very nice. She was praising it, and the deputy mayor said, you know, Ms. Jacobs, actually, we were just about to demolish it because this is too chaotic and this is not in line with our strategy, with the strategy we see for the city. And fortunately, it didn't happen, so North End is still there in Boston, and you can check it if you're in Boston and enjoy the same lively atmosphere. But the city on the left faced a different fate. And as I said, and as you might have noticed, it resembles very much some outskirts of Moscow or Warsaw or Minsk or Kharkiv, somewhere in Eastern Europe. But actually this is America as well. This is the city of St. Louis. And one of the most, again, a very prominent case of how central planning went wrong. So the idea, again, was very noble. The planners wanted to build a new neighborhood to provide affordable housing for the poor people, for the poor families. And as you see, they decided so that to make everyone equal, to build this uniform, similar skyscrapers, towers, but something went wrong. So people moved in, and in a while, this part of the city became the most criminalized and dangerous part, to a point that even the police officers were refusing to enter it. Like 80% of the whole drug traffic in the city was situated in this small neighborhood. And people felt afraid walking there at night because, as you can see, the distances between the towers is such that there's nowhere to hide if you face a danger. And people, those families who were at least a bit better off, who could afford living, started living. So this part became completely dangerous and marginalized, and in the end, the experiment was considered a failure, and the neighborhood was blown up. So it was blown up, but the idea is still alive and it's still practiced in many places all over the world. The idea that the government knows better how cities should function, how land should be used in a city, and who should live where. So my story, as Sven mentioned, is in a way a bit similar to Jane Jacobs' one, because I also started as a journalist in Moscow. My first degree was in journalism, but I've also always been fascinated with my own city, Moscow, and local politics. And at the age of 20, I became a local councillor, one of the youngest in Russia, and I faced a lot of and I faced a moral dilemma. So I was representing the Libertarian Party, and as you know,
you might know libertarians, we believe in minimal government. And where is the border between how minimal the government can be in a city, how much liberty can be afforded in a successful city, and how much regulation do we need? Where is the line between what's public and what's private? How to deal with externalities? How to deal with who provides public goods? Who will build the roads, as they say? So these old questions were I was asking myself when I got elected. And just to give you an impression of what was my work as a councillor, I'll mention this case as a case study. So, if you look at this picture, it might look like a result of some hurricane or airstrike, but this is actually urban development as Moscow city administration views it. So, hipster Stalinism, I love this expression very much. It was coined by the Guardian newspaper in an article about the Moscow urban policies. So, we had, about 10 years ago, in Moscow, we had a new mayor and a whole new team of the city administrators who wanted to make, they pledged to make Moscow a modern, walkable, nice European capital. So even the motto they was using was Europe is closer than you think. But they wanted to make it using the same old authoritarian, at times even Stalinist methods. Hence hipster Stalinism was the term for these policies. And this is one of the examples. So one morning, the Muscovites woke up, looked out of their windows and see this picture all over the city. So overnight the government demolished over 100 small shops all over the capital. Why? Well, officially because they were built illegally, broken the rules, didn't have enough papers, all the needed papers. But later on the work courts and many of the shop owners proved that they had all the permissions and that their shops were built legally. But actually it was they were quite open about it in the government that they just wanted to demolish it because it didn't look nice to them. Because they would say this is like, these shops were ugly, so they just developed their own design of a shop that were meant to replace this. And the problem is that those urbanists in the government, and unfortunately a lot of urbanists outside the government, a lot of civil activists who truly want the city to become beautiful. They believe that beautiful cities are like cities that we all like. I don't know, you name it, Barcelona, Amsterdam, like these nice European capitals where we like to walk, where you can cycle, that they are so beautiful as a result of some sophisticated master plan. But actually, those are the results of institutions, of good institutions, because, and so why some cities are, in some cities you can see nice streets, nice shops, and in other cities, large part of them turn into slums, because some cities have this clever, sophisticated master planners, and some just lack experts in planning. About 30 years ago, Peruvian economist Hernando de Soto was asking a similar question. He wanted to find out why half of the Peruvian economy was in the gray sector, and why half of the Lima, the capital city population, lived in illegal houses. So, as he discovered, he and his team that almost all of the street markets in Lima were built illegally. Almost all of the city transport was operating illegally. And yes, half of the city population left in illegally built houses. Why was it so? He asked. Because people just hated following the rules. They wanted to break the law. And he decided to make an experiment. He and his team wanted to just open a small shop in Lima. And can you guess how long it took them to get through the red tape and get all the needed documents? Any ideas?
1 year.
Yes, 1 year and over 100 administrative steps. So this pretty much answers the question why people prefer living in informal settlements other than following the rules and building a house and building an infrastructure, because of the red tape. And they decided to go further and to open a street market. As you can see, only 20 of street markets back then were legal, compared to almost 300 illegal ones. And they started the process, but they gave up very quickly, because they just calculated and they realized that would take them over 15 years. 15 years of full-time job just to open a market legally. So this basically explains this. This explains why in some cities we have order without design, we have beautiful, good-looking streets, and in some cities we have slums. Because of the institutions, because why would a shop owner invest in improving beautification of its shop if he or she knows that tomorrow the government might come and bulldoze his shop? And conversely, in a European city, in a city where property rights are secure, the owners of shops or the owners of the property owners, they have all the incentives to invest in making them more good-looking, because they can exert profits, and their children and their grandchildren can make money of it. So now I live in London. Now I'm doing my PhD there, and as Sven mentioned, I'm working in an architecture company. And this picture, this is South Kensington, one of the most posh and luxury, the most prestigious places in London. This is, no surprise that Russian oligarchs buy their houses there. And again, if you walk along the street in South Kensington and stop some passerby and ask, how do you think this street became that beautiful, they would say, well, probably there was a master planner, probably someone in the London administration back in the 17th, 18th century had a very good taste, and they imposed this taste on the city. But actually, back then, when South Kensington or Chelsea or Covent Garden or Belgravia or other nice parts of London were built, there was no central plan, there was no even a central authority. Back until the late 20th century, London didn't have even a city administration. It only had councils of the borough councils with boroughs and districts. And so who provided all the infrastructure? How did this harmonious city, how did this harmonious, beautiful streets emerge without any zoning laws, and how they dealt with free rider problem? So if someone provided infrastructure, how did they make others pay for it, all the users? Actually, instead of the zoning law or master plans, they used a purely market-based mechanism that was called covenants. So covenants were conditions tied to the use of land And those were conditions that the landowner imposed on the developer, property developer, while renting out the land. And they could be used, for example, to control the maximum height, or even the design of the facade, or the construction materials. Or, for example, a property owner, a landowner could make the developer provide and maintain public spaces around the development, such as parks or pavements or some green zones, and even deal with externalities. For example, do not let do not let the noisy inhabitants live there, and control that there's no polluting industries located around. Why would they care? Why would a property owner or a developer care about all these public goods if their aim was just to make profit, to exert as much profit from their land as they could? Why did they care? Yeah.
Make the city working perfectly, and they don't want to be disturbed, and this is why everyone cares in the city. This is my answer.
It will be like I don't know how to say it, maybe the translator can help me, plusvalia in Spanish.
Added value.
Like the added value will grow.
Yeah, exactly. So they made it out of pure self-interest, because if the whole area, the whole neighborhood is so nice and safe and quiet, then the price that you can, people will be willing to pay higher price to live there. So this is how city with secure property rights and with good institutions and with rule of law where contracts are enforced end up with beautiful, harmonious streets without any zoning law. And as I said, there was largely no regulations, no zoning laws in Britain up until the mid-20th century. And everything changed in 1947 when the Town and Country Planning Act was passed, which, well, not eradicated, but very strictly diminished undermined the private property on land in the UK. So before that, if someone owns a land, they could do more or less anything with it. After the law was passed, then for any development, an owner needed permission from a local council. And the result is that London is a city with one of the most inflated rents in Europe. So today, house prices, according to the estimates, are 4 times the cost of building a home. What it means? It means that if you want to build a home, then 25% of the money you will spend will cover the actual cost of construction, like bricks and so on, and the labor, and other 75% will be spent on getting through the red tape. So these are the results of regulations. But of course, because as I said, cities are places where creative people get together, then they find creative solutions around these regulations. And one of those is this new trend which is emerging in a lot of big cities, of the trend of microflats. So what is a microflat? It's a very relative definition, because in microflat, what is considered a microflat in London is a normal flat in Japan, for example, in Tokyo. But in general, a microflat is a flat that is below the legal minimum, because in many places there is a legal minimum floor space that a flat can be. So in London, this is 37 square meters. And so some people, as I said, one of the greatest things about big cities is diversity. And diversity means that people, they have different preferences. Some people would prefer living in a bigger flat. Others would be okay with a smaller flat, but if it can get them a more central location. So, for example, young professionals, young single professionals, very often make a choice in favor of central location and are willing to give up extra square meters to live closer to all the amenities, to parks, restaurants, museums, and closer to their work. But then the government comes in and says, excuse me, you cannot do it, this is an infringement of human dignity. This is a quotation from one of the articles dedicated to microflats. They called it the infringement of human dignity, saying living in a flat that is smaller than a certain area. Although for some people, spending 2 hours a day in a packed train is a much greater infringement of human dignity. But as I said, there's not always, we don't always have choice. And so if it's illegal, how does it function? Well, the entrepreneurs, the developers who are building these microflats, micro-apartments, they are using the loopholes in the regulations. So, for example, they can register them as student accommodations, as hostels, and so on. And it works. And I myself was doing a research on microflats, and while doing it, I persuaded myself so much that by the day it was published, I had moved from an outskirts of London to a microflat in a city, in a city center. So now I can walk to my work and I can walk to my university, and this is really helpful. But why, if it's so helpful, why are there so many opponents of microflats? Why the government is in many places trying to ban them, and why the architects are also arguing against it? Well, if you Google microflats, you can very easily find pictures like this. So the opponents will say, do you want our beautiful European capital, which London is, to turn into some slums, to look like this? And they usually post those pictures. This particular one made in China of several families who have to cram in a tiny box with no windows. But the thing is that these pictures, these flats, these are not microflats. These are the direct results of regulations. Because microflat is something that's designed and built on purpose. And this is what happens when you ban building small flats, and people have to live in regular flats, subdividing them between several families. So again, if we remember Hernando de Soto's lesson, this is what happens when you ban legally building smaller flats legally. And so another sphere in a city where entrepreneurs and innovators are finding solutions and at some time are winning, where the private alternatives are actually act better than state monopolies on an urban level, is the sphere of transport. Another story is very telling. Another example from London. So 2 years ago, the London government wanted to ban Uber in the city, and of course, Uber is used by many people in London because we have black cabs, that famous black cabs, and to become a taxi driver in an officially licensed black cab, one has to take a couple years of training and learn by heart every single street in London, which is completely unnecessary now that we have Google Maps. But the taxi drivers, the licensed taxi drivers, didn't want to lose their market to a more agile, their more agile competitors, so they lobbied this ban. And and Uber just sent the push notification to all of its London-based users, asking to sign a petition to save the service. And within less than a week, over 1 million Londoners signed this petition to reverse the decision, and Uber was saved, and I used it while traveling here. So, and I have a question to you. Who of you used Uber or a similar app recently? Okay, so why did you get into a stranger's car? Why were not you afraid? Yeah.
Because in Armenia we have that kind of application, and all know that this application used by taxi drivers who are most competent, and it's better than any other taxi service. So, but besides it, it's linked. He is linked to his phone. There are some contact. Which is not in case of other taxi drivers, which can I stop?
But how did you know that that particular driver wasn't, I don't know, a criminal?
It's just trust to the company, to Uber, to other companies that work in this.
And why did you trust? Who did you trust? Actually, it's in my country, they filter drivers, so it's just to that particular company. Yes.
Yeah, well, when you book your car, you get the rating, the feedback. As the feedback, people have reviewed it. So it helps us to know who the person's coming and what kind of reputation or the feedback he has already received.
So you have the evaluation of other users.
Yeah.
And why do you trust other users? They are also strangers to you. You've never seen them as well before.
Because they are also users like me. So if I have to go with that driver, I have to take their feedback seriously.
So here comes what I would call the magic of social capital. And this is a very, to me, it was a mind-blowing study. It was, so as I mentioned, the Berlin Wall fell 30 years ago. And a couple of years ago, the German Institute for the Study of Labor decided to measure the level of social capital in different regions of Germany. And social capital is the term that social scientists use to evaluate the level of trust, interpersonal trust between people, which transforms into horizontal ties. And as proxies for social capital, they used the amount of people involved in volunteering activities, the amount of people, the amount of startups, the level of crimes and so on. There were number of measures, and they found a striking thing that even 3 decades after the fall of the Berlin Wall, there is still a significant difference in the level of social capital between the eastern and the western regions. So even if you take Berlin, the capital city, you could sense that difference. And this, I think, is a very, very important thing to understand, because you might have heard that, yes, probably the market economics is good at creating wealth, but it's also on the other side, it's alienating people, creating the war, resulting in a war of all against all. That in a capitalist society, unlike in a socialist society, people don't trust each other, they don't support each other, and so on. I'm sure you've heard this many times. But as you can see, the studies prove it wrong, that in the cities, that it's exactly in the post, so the same trend can be seen all across Europe. So in post-socialist, post-communist countries, where the government for decades has been eradicating all the bottom-up grassroots movements, either in a method like forceful way, or just replacing the grassroots activities with state-imposed, like for example the grassroots trade unions with the state-controlled ones and so on. In those countries, people have forgot how to trust each other, and they have to rebuild this trust again. In Moscow, again, there was an example during Stalin's rule. There was the large-scale renovation in Moscow, and one of the goals was to deliberately destroy the public spaces where people could get together, meet their neighbors, and build up this horizontal ties on a local level, so that people lost trust in each other, and as we know, it all resulted in great terror, and people reporting each other for alleged crimes. So, and during my years in the local council, I came to the conclusion that one of the main reasons, one of the main things that local, like a libertarian local councillor could do in a country like Russia was to help rebuild this horizontal ties, to help people trust each other again. So social capital can bridge the people, it can create bridges between different communities, and sometimes even literally. Can you guess what's unusual about this bridge on a picture? Why is it special? Any ideas? Yeah.
Non, vas-y. Habituellement, un pont, c'est un ouvrage de franchissement. Donc, il y a un obstacle qu'on traverse, soit l'eau. Mais là, on voit qu'il n'y a rien. Mais...
Usually, you use a bridge to cross an obstacle, either to cross a river or an obstacle, whatever it is. But there is nothing here.
No, actually, it's not seen on a picture, but there is a railway. So this bridge is performing the function that the bridge is performing. It's more about the way it was created.
Donc le pont remplit sa fonction, mais c'est plus la manière dont il a été conçu. Plus par rapport à la manière dont il a été conçu.
Maybe the shape of the bridge.
La forme du pont.
Just for cars.
Not really. So again, it's about the way that bridge was created. I was just talking about social capital. Why is this bridge epitomizing the idea of social capital?
Pourquoi est-ce que le pont symbolise l'idée du capital social?
Parce qu'en principe, quand on dit pont, ça relie deux points qui sont distants. Donc un pont déjà il sert au déplacement et c'est une forme de communication.
Because a bridge brings together or links up 2 points which are away from each other. It's a way to communicate.
Okay, so the story goes like this. This bridge is it's connecting. It is in Rotterdam, and it's connecting two parts of the city previously separated by the railroads. And a local architecture startup came up with the idea to build this bridge, and they exhibited it in the local council, and the people loved it. But the local government said, "We're sorry, we like it too, but there's no we don't have enough budget for that." And the local people said, "Okay, no problem," and they crowdfunded those money, and they built a bridge. So this bridge was built without any government, without any centralized funding, just as a result of a bottom-up cooperation. And the greatest thing, in my view, is that such examples can be found not only in countries like the Netherlands, which are relatively wealthy and liberal and democratic, but they can be found all over the world, anywhere. So in Ukraine, where I lived for a couple of years, there's a project called Urban 100. It started from a relatively small town of Ivano-Frankivsk in western Ukraine, where 100 local entrepreneurs got together and decided to establish a fund that would take care of public spaces, organize charity events, and musical concert, all sorts of activities that we usually expect the local government to deliver. And the idea was, the project was so successful that they started replicating it all over Ukraine. So just 3 days ago, I was at a talk in Kiev at a similar, but in Kiev it was Urban 500 because they managed to get more stakeholders there. But the idea is it's springing and it's flourishing. And I'm sure that if after the talk we have enough time to chat, that I will hear a lot of similar stories from many of you from your respective countries. So as we see, sometimes we can, sometimes the people using smart technologies, using smart ways to cooperate and having enough social capital can deliver what we consider public goods without any government intervention. But can we go further? Can we imagine a city that would be completely successfully run without or almost without any central government? Well, there is a city like that, and this example again comes from the United States. The city of Sandy Springs in the state of Georgia privatized, or as they call it, incorporated. They don't call it a private city, they call it an incorporated city. So they privatized most of the municipal services, from road maintenance to cleaning streets. So most of the services except, well, the police and the firefighting. And now the city of it's not a tiny city, as you can see. It's a city of over 100,000 people. It even has the central business district with skyscrapers. But the whole city is run by only seven public officials. And this city administration, which only has 7 employees, they don't even have their own town hall. They rent an office from a private company. And this scheme is now saving a city over $20 million a year. And still the city is, so it's in... So you can Sandy Springs is making it to the top of the top of the rankings in terms of citizen satisfaction with municipal services. And for example, its parks were considered one of the best in the country. And a number of surrounding cities, I think it's 4 by now, have adopted the same model of incorporated city, which means that people, it's not just numbers, it's really the citizen satisfaction, which shows that it works. But the thing is, even a city which is run in a bottom-up manner, which has very limited government, it's still part of a country, and the country, and so the citizens, even if they can manage the city on their own, they still have to abide the federal laws and pay federal taxes, and there's only that much autonomy that a city can get. But so today we use all the world as we see it as divided between nation states, but it's not the way it's been for the most part of history. So if the historians believe that, again, this is something, these are very different pictures, but this is something in common between them. So the historians believe that the first cities that ever emerged in the world were governed as city-states. So this is roughly 6,000 years ago, somewhere in ancient Sumer, and they were governed as city-states. And the picture on the right is also a city-state, but a modern one, a very modern one, Singapore. And more and more scholars, urbanists, futurologists are saying that probably the city-state, like the nation-state is a temporary thing, and the city-state might be the governance form of the future. Because now that the world is changing so fast, so quickly, now that the technologies are transforming everything so fast, cities should be more flexible and more adaptable, and a city-state is a more so both in terms of efficiency and in terms of fairness, like a city-state is where people can have greater influence on the decision-making, and they are more adaptable, and they are more agile, and than nation-states in terms of transforming to changing conditions. So they are more competitive, and also they allow for experimentation with legal environments in a much more efficient way than nation-states. So a lot of people today are voting with their feet. We choose jurisdiction. We choose to move from one place to another based on the legal environment, because we have our own goals, aspirations, and dreams. And we choose a place where we will need to input less effort to get our dreams come true. And so the countries in turn are competing for people. They're trying to change the rules so that to become more attractive so some are doing it by lowering taxes, others are doing it by providing some preferences to creative people, to startups, for example, and so on. And So, and the governments, as I said, so it is quite hard to make these experiments on a country level, but it's much easier to make them on a city level, and this is why a lot of governments are doing it. And interestingly, not just the liberal, the democratic governments, but also some authoritarian governments, which they wouldn't want to change the regime on a national level, but for example, take Hong Kong. It's an example of like when you take part of a country and with an entirely different legal system. I mean, compare Hong Kong and mainland China, and you get an entirely different result. So a lot of countries wanted to replicate the success, and in various parts of the world, these experiments bear different names. So some call them charter cities, new areas, foreign trade zones, international business districts, economic cities, and so on. But the idea is roughly the same: to create an oasis of liberalism and market economy, to attract the most productive and creative people with low regulations and with more opportunities for growth and for art, for creativity, and to see how it results in prosperity growth. So, of course, it's not all that rosy, and I have to mention a few challenges that these projects are facing before providing some examples. So I'll name the two main ones. One is the transaction cost. So it is quite easy to install an Uber app and stop using the licensed black cabs and start using this private alternative, innovative alternative. But it's much harder to leave behind everything you have, your job, your family, your friends, and relocate to some remote island just because the legal system there is more open and more flexible because you like it more than in your own country. And the second problem, which I think is bigger, because transaction costs, as you know, you've been talking here about smart cities. Transaction costs it's something that are becoming less and less an obstacle, because we are being empowered by technologies that make us cooperate without the middleman, and so this is something that I think will incrementally get minimal. But the second problem, I think, is a more fundamental one. This is a problem of political control, because, as I said, all the land in the world is divided between nation states. So to get this oasis, this free city, voluntary city, you still need a permission and an approval from some of the national governments. And it is, strangely, these are usually not the most democratic government which experiment with these regimes, because only a relatively authoritarian country, a ruler can just say, let's take this piece of the desert and create a special economic zone here. So where's the guarantee that 10 years from now, after the investors put a lot of money and a lot of people move to the zone and it becomes prosperous, where's the guarantee that the government will not come and say thank you, and will not nationalize all the profits, and will not crack down on all this all the civil liberties that people enjoy there? And this is an open question. So, for example, China is very big on this new areas or special jurisdictions, special economic zones. They are now creating them all over the country in an attempt to replicate the Hong Kong experience. But if Hong Kong was is and still is a market economy and a liberal society, these new areas, which are multiple and which are springing up all over the country, they are governed in a very top-down way. So, for example, take this Lianjiang new area. It's in a Chongqing city, and the idea of the central government, it was authorized by the Communist Party of China. The idea is to create the Silicon Valley of China there. So that's why they're trying to attract as many IT businesses, high-tech businesses as they can by introducing flexible land and house policies, the tax deductions for high-tech companies, lower enterprise tax, and so on. But for some reason, these high-tech startups are not rushing to open their businesses in China. So there was a case widely discussed in the media of another zone which was meant to become like a startup paradise, and the journalists came in China. It was launched about 10 years ago, and then the journalists came there and looked around, and they saw the completely empty streets. And for example, they saw there were like the Chinese government announced that a lot of like world biggest companies like Amazon, for example, opened their headquarters in the city. But then the journalists came and they realized that they didn't open the headquarters. They just put the sign so that they don't have a problem with the government, but no one was working there, because this is not how Silicon Valley, the original Silicon Valley emerged. It wasn't the decision of the American government that this is going to be the oasis of high tech. It just emerged as a result of a bottom-up processes. And another country which is even less associated with freedom is Saudi Arabia. And again, they have this Saudi Vision 2030, which is a plan of creating, so far it's 6 economic cities, 6 special jurisdictions, and some of them on paper look pretty revolutionary, like for example, the Neom city is going to be the first transnational city. It's planned to be built on the border between Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Egypt. And according to the government plans, it will not only enjoy the the lower taxes and everything you expect from a free economic zone, but also much more liberal civil rights, which for a country like Saudi Arabia is quite a revolutionary thing. But as you can infer from this picture, so far most of these cities are. So this one, for example, King Abdul Economic City, was launched about 10 years ago, and still it looks like a few unfinished skyscrapers in the middle of the desert. Again, because if the country is killing its journalists, for example, as we know the story, that horrible story that happened in Turkey in the Saudi embassy, then there's little reasons for investors to trust them, and they will have to make an extra effort to prove that they're trustworthy when launching a project like this. This experiment is, in my view, much more curious, interesting, and promising. So it started with a TED Talk given by an economist, Paul Romer. Last year he was given he received a Nobel Prize in Economics, but that was 10 years ago. And he gave a TED talk called Charter City for Dummies. So his idea was, again, he was referencing Hong Kong as an example, and he was suggesting these charter cities as a solution for developing countries with corrupt institutions. So his idea was that, again, there are a lot of countries which are struggling with reforming their institutions, because it's very hard to reform this, to make a profound institutional reform on a national level when the country is controlled by some interest groups, mafia clans. Even the most benevolent ruler might be struggling in reforming the institutions on a national level. But we can try doing it on a local level. So what if we allocate a part of the country and make it what he called a charter city, make it an autonomous zone with that would enjoy all possible autonomy you can think of. And this idea, soon after the talk, he was approached by the out of all countries, by Honduras, by the Honduran president, who suggested that they try this experiment on the Honduran soil, and as a result, they came up with a blueprint for a city that would be governed by an independent international board of directors. So that was basically supposed to be a corporation, other than a city with private police and courts, with minimal taxes, and most strikingly with the autonomy to make their own international trade deals. So, and there was a big story, but again, unfortunately, as in all the previous cases, the problem was that the Honduran government was not as trustworthy. So the idea of this city was to show, to become an example, to show the rest of the country the importance and the potential of the wealth-generating potential of strong institutions. First of all, strong property rights and rule of law. And what did they start? How did they start doing it? The Honduran government started illegally taking lands from farmers to create the city. And when Paul Romer and other international experts who were on the board saw it, they just resigned. Paul Romer himself resigned, because you cannot you cannot create a rule of law by breaking the basic things like property rights. This is not the way it works. And as I said, again, what can we do if we want to experiment, if we want to create a smart city and to see how it, if we want to experiment with these legal regimes, and all the land is controlled by some nation states. So some people thought, why don't we try the ocean? And the idea of seasteading, it is advanced by many people, but the most famous of them is probably Peter Thiel, the co-founder of PayPal, the American businessman, and so he launched an initiative that's called the Seasteading Institute, and the idea is to create these floating platforms, floating cities in the neutral waters that do not belong to any nation state. And the first city of this kind is planned to be launched as soon as 2022. And of course, this won't be a proper city, so the first one will be more like a condominium for about several hundred people. But the whole idea, as you can see, they are powered by, this is a render, this is not a picture, but this is how they envision it. They are powered by solar panels, so they can be completely autonomous. And this is what, so I had a chance to ask, I was at a conference where Peter Thiel was speaking, and I had a chance to ask him a question, whether he believes that we cannot reform the cities that we have, and our only hope is to build these floating platforms in the middle of the ocean. And he said that more or less the same as the director, previously the director of the Seasteading Institute said, John Quirk, that it's not about, it's not that one is better than the other, it's about creating the huge diversity of governments, regimes and lifestyles for the huge diversity of people. And so coming back to Jane Jacobs, whom I cited in the beginning of the talk, that cities, cities have the capability of providing something for everybody, only because and only when they are created by everybody. So I think that, yes, so I'm not advocating for moving to a floating platform, but I hope that through smart technologies and smart policies and through good institutions, we can all get cities that are built by created for everyone by everyone, and they can provide something for every lifestyle. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vera, for this interesting talk through like so many different countries, so many examples, and you also have a very helpful reading list there. That's something we always ask. You see that we have a couple of books here too that I always bring to my seminars. Here's, I think, a common book that we both very much appreciate. And we mentioned a couple of these authors, like Triumph of the City before, Elena Ostrom we also mentioned before. So now, before we break into the discussion, let's have one quick reflection, have a couple of quick reflection groups like we usually do to have a more targeted question and answers. So maybe all of you get together just for 2 minutes, think about like questions that come to your mind, and then we will have a more targeted discussion. So this is the first one. Let's see.